current debate about defunding the police, it's become this bipolar conversation about either no police or complete anarchy, and that has people coming down on this side of the argument one way or the other in a unconstructive way for what we're trying to achieve here as a society. Give us a sense of genuine police reform and defunding the police in tangible steps that people can understand does not mean letting the country become lawless, but at the same time means we are not going to kill unarmed black people.
Sure. No one wants anarchy in our country. What we're calling for is defund because we need to reprioritize. We spend over $100 billion a year on law enforcement in this country. And what we're saying is instead of talking about community policing, I think Atlanta probably would say they have community policing. So would New York. Instead of saying, let's give them more money for training, instead, let's take away some of that money and let's put it into social workers. Let's put it into violence interrupters. Let's put it into more schools because, we continue to find money for the police at the same time that we have been closing schools. We have shut down public hospitals. We have taken money away from affordable housing so that we have a homelessness problem in this country. And so we're talking about refunding that money, redirecting that money into things that would make communities safer, safe from the police, but also safe and free in a different kind of way. And so we can do it, but we have to have the public will. And, one of the things that we should be paying attention to, and Congress needs to pay attention to this, and the Democrats need to pay attention to this, what are the people in the streets demanding? And it's not just black people. We have white allies who are by our side saying defund the police because we see that we have to reimagine safety for all of us.
Yeah, in my experience of covering some of the protests in the early stages of this, certainly in Philadelphia, it was multi-generational, multi-racial. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Paul Butler, let me get your thoughts really quickly from the Fulton County District Attorney Paul Howard. He put out a statement in part that reads, "My office has already launched an intense independent investigation of the incident. Members of the Fulton County District Attorney's Office were on scene shortly after the shooting, and we have been in investigative sessions ever since to identify all of the facts and circumstances surrounding this incident." Give me your legal take on where an investigation like this goes. What are some of the fundamental questions that you need answered to determine the course of action as a district attorney?
Was the shooting justified? We have no evidence that it was. Again, Mr. Brooks faced no deadly threat, and so he was not allowed under the law to kill someone in response. At the end of the day, this is about culture. This is about a warrior mentality among the Atlanta Police Department. The Georgia NAACP president said we're done dying. That's only going to be true if police departments are not just reformed, but transformed.
All right, Philip, you're back with us next hour. Thank you to both Judith Brown, Dianis, and Paul Butler. Thank you both for joining us this hour. Coming up, Donald Trump ramps up another photo op. Stay with us.
COVID-19 is hitting some than others. Joy Reid examines how the coronavirus pandemic is particularly hurting those struggling with poverty, including minimum wage workers, meat packers, and farmers.
They're usually in debt up to their eyeballs because they can't pay for all the equipment that it takes to run a farm.
Joining Joy will be Bishop William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign and musician and activist Willie Nelson. American Crisis, Poverty in the Pandemic, tonight at 10 on MSNBC.
Hosting power of beat.
When you have the Chase mobile app, your bank can be virtually any place.
And COVID-19, the do what I say, not what I do mindset continues from the Trump administration. Will the president's plan for campaign rallies to start this week in indoor arenas with optional masks spark even more spread? We'll check in with former FDA Commissioner Dr. Scott Gottlieb. After a volatile week on Wall Street, we'll talk with the head of the Dallas Federal Reserve, Robert Kaplan. Plus, political perspective in these troubled times from our John Dickerson. It's all just ahead on Face the Nation. Good morning and welcome welcome to Face the Nation. After 19 straight days and nights of outrage following the death of George Floyd, a weary and emotionally drained America has settled into a trifecta of crises affecting every part of our culture and society. We will continue to bring you all the news on all three fronts as the race to contain the coronavirus, to repair our devastated economy, and to fix systemic racism keeps moving. CBS News national correspondent Mark Strassman begins our coverage today from Atlanta.
Atlanta, known as the city too busy to hate, was in turmoil overnight. Protesters enraged by another deadly police shooting took to the streets. They blocked a stretch of downtown interstate, confronted by dozens of police in riot gear. Atlanta was burning. Some protesters torched this Wendy's, where the shooting took place. On Friday night, 2 white Atlanta police officers wrestled with Rayshard Brooks after he failed a sobriety field test. He grabbed one of their tasers and ran. The second officer chased him, firing his taser. Seconds later, off camera, you hear what sounds like 3 gunshots. The 27-year-old Brooks died at the hospital. Investigators say he had turned around and pointed a taser at the officer chasing him, and the officer shot him. Within 24 hours, Atlanta's police chief resigned, and Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms called for the officer to be fired.
There is a clear distinction between what you can do and what you should do.
Officer Devin Brosnan was terminated. His partner Garrett Rolfe was suspended. It's the latest deadly moment that explains this: Saturday's march in Los Angeles and another in Washington, D.C. In all 50 states, protesters demand a vaccine for America's other killer virus, racism. Police chokeholds, police budgets, police attitudes, all under review. But expect a fight.
To then demonize police officers as if we're the problem, as if we broke the window, as if we caused the violence. That is absolutely outrageous.
Another familiar battleground. Confederate symbols keep falling, like rebel soldiers at Pickett's charge. NASCAR banned the rebel flag. Confederate statues toppled or vandalized across the South. But as crowds clamor for an American renewal, there's a new health worry. In at least 20 states, new COVID cases are rising. Experts see a potential health threat in crowds of protesters shoulder to shoulder, shouting. Back in Atlanta, Chris Stewart is the lawyer for Rayshard Brooks' family.
I could even say we want justice, but I don't even care anymore. I don't even know what that is.
This is the Wendy's where the original confrontation took place. This city is bracing for another round of protests tonight. Atlanta is smoldering, just like this restaurant. Margaret?
Mark Strassman, thanks. We go now to Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, and Republican Senator Tim Scott. Good morning to you, Senator.
Good morning, Margaret. I hope you're doing well.
It's great to have you back. I want to get into your proposals, but first ask you about what's happened overnight, where protests are continuing in Atlanta after Rayshard Brooks was shot. The officer who shot him has been fired. The police chief has resigned. Do you agree that this was not an appropriate use of force?
Well, it seems like the mayor says it was an excessive use of force. That's really the question. The question is, when the suspect turned to fire the taser, what should the officer have done? One of the challenges that we have in these split-second decisions is the need for more training. That's why the de-escalation aspect of my bill and the House bill is so critically important, so that we don't revert back to basic fear plus adrenaline leads us to the genetic code, so to speak. That's a hard balance to achieve. So in order for us to provide more opportunities to de-escalate these situations and to reduce the use of force, we have to have effective training. That situation is certainly a far less clear one than the ones that we saw with George Floyd and several other ones around the country.
Well, this
with Russians, and so that started its own, narrative in the press. And I just want to point out that all of these years later, Carter Page was never charged. So for a year he was surveilled on lawful.
It would probably
matters. So there's certainly something cultural and symbolic shifting that is transformational. What remains to be seen is, the structural aspects. Are we going to see actual reforms? Are we actually going to see policy changes? Are we going to see the ways in which, traditionally the state has failed Black people and brown people? Are we going to see those things shift dramatically the way that we saw them shift in, say, the 1950s, 1960s with these other protest moments? And that's essentially what people are responding to right now. They're responding to this larger failure across multiple and overlapping sectors of society. So they're resulting, the failure of the economy, right? High unemployment rates. They're coming from the failures of, a pandemic, a global pandemic that has hit African American communities especially hard. And then, of course, they're coming from the failures of a system like policing that has consistently failed and harmed Black communities. So that's why we're seeing these uprisings right now and these kind of protests.
And Yvette Simpson, it has been remarkable to see the kinds of changes happen in such a swift fashion. The NFL apologizing, corporate America announcing investments across the board, promising to diversify their boards, even as we pointed out, television right now. We haven't seen this kind of change take hold so fast.
Yeah, it's a different time. And, as someone who led a city during Trayvon Martin, we actually had a police-involved shooting in my city when I was elected leader. George Floyd just hit differently. It ruptured something that was already broken. We were still doing our 2.23 for Ahmaud Arbery. Breonna Taylor was murdered. Her murderers are still out in public. And then this happened. And we watched for 8 minutes and 46 seconds a man die in front of us. And it has changed the conversation. And I think this is an important time to talk about getting beyond performance theater and talking about real change. I think as Leah said earlier, folks who would not utter Black Lives Matter are now saying it. People who protested against someone taking a knee are now taking a knee. And I think the question is, so what now? What are we going to see real change as a result of what's happened in this country? And I think I want to highlight as well the global nature of the protests that we've seen. We're seeing people around the world coming out day after day saying something must change. And so it's on us now to say, what are we going to do? Are we really going to root out the systemic racism and institutional racism that has brought us to this point?
So much of it is centered on the debate around police reform as well. Chris Christie, I want to bring you in on this because you were governor of New Jersey when the city of Camden actually dismantled its police force, created something new. Talk about what you learned from that experience.
What we learned is that this can be done and the country has to follow this example, George. The two main things that happened in Camden were community policing. We got police officers out of their cars, onto bicycles, on foot, and embedded them in the community, both from a law enforcement perspective and socially, George, working with the communities and working with young men and women in the communities to develop trust. Second was de-escalation training. And the watchword for the de-escalation training is first do no harm. And that violence is a last resort. What's happened in Camden since then? In the 7 years since we implemented those changes, the murder rate in Camden, which at the time in 2012 was the most dangerous city in America, is down 81%. But even more important than that, George, is that citizen complaints of excessive use of force by police are down 95% in the last 7 years. And so this can be done. It's a false choice to say that we can't have effective law enforcement without the violence that we're seeing that's going on in so many of our places across the country. Camden, New Jersey, which is a 96% minority city, we worked together. We brought down the murder rate by 81% and brought down excessive use of force by police by 95%. I think Yvette is absolutely right. It's time to stop talking and start doing. It was done in Camden. It can be done in other places around this country. It should be.
And of course, Roman, you've also had to deal with this both in the White House during the 1994 crime bill with President Clinton, Chief of Staff to President Obama, and of course as mayor in the city of Chicago, which has had so many controversies.
Yeah. George, I'd make 2 points. First and foremost, you have to, all on us, what the protesters have showed is that the lack of investment in mental health, drug treatment, homelessness, and housing, that is our societal failure. Police should not be responsible for that. And we're going to have to step up and do our investments to bring in equity across the cities and across the country. Number two, You have to reimagine and re-energize community policing so police are a part of a community rather than standing apart from that community. And that's the only way to build trust and cooperation and collaboration. There is too much distrust. Third and final, there's a strategy in policing called broken windows. It is totally broken. It needs to be ripped out of police departments. You're going to need massive retraining, massive de-escalation, and a whole different approach so police have a legitimacy which they do not have in the community. And then I want to pick up on what the professor said, which I think is really important. I think the people out on the streets are actually exercising their fundamentals as citizens. They know America is an idea and a set of ideals, and it has fallen dramatically short from that. It's the only country not built on culture, religion, or a language. It is a set of ideals, and we all have seen ourselves fall dramatically short from the ideals of this country, and it's calling on us, all of us, to collectively put our shoulder to the wheel to actually fulfill those ideals after literally 200 to 400 years of going way short of that. Way short of that goal.
And Professor, we're going to pick up on that. It is strong.
The Jaguars.
Let your word inspire, change the atmosphere.
The global pandemic, to pull out from it.
I see a very big distinction between the police brutality and then the protests after it. In other words, Europeans seem to regard the protests as an example of American democracy in action, based on the commentary I've read and seen. And it actually has resulted in people in Europe looking at their own societies and asking themselves, do we have systemic racism in France or in Britain?
I think, these debates do cross the Atlantic. We've seen debates cross the Atlantic in the past. So it's not surprising that some of this resonates in Europe. But we're talking about a different part of the world. We do have our own complexities here in Europe. And I think that democracies have these debates. So, the hope, surely, on both sides of the Atlantic, for people like me and you who do care about, defending democratic principles and a rules-based environment and individual freedoms and rights. The hope must be that, just like people in the US are defending and fighting to uphold principles, essential principles, people in Europe are also, interested in that kind of fight. So I'm not too worried also about, perhaps in the future there will be more bridges between us. But right now, with this US administration, it feels like we belong to different worlds, in terms of attitude towards what kind of world we want to have together. And you mentioned Russia and China. We know here in Europe that, we are a complex part of the world. We risk being turned into a playground of rather hostile big powers, external powers. And I think that one of the things we have to think about much harder in Europe, and this is happening slowly, in the face of all this, confusion and hostility that we feel from the US administration, is to think about how, as Europeans, we manage to build the cohesion in Europe among ourselves so that we can defend things that we care about in this pretty complex world of, again, power rivalry. Yeah.
Parag, let me ask you to pick up on what Natalie was saying. Is there a sense in Asia that perhaps the ideals that America once was seen as standing for, or the openness, is now more available? I'm thinking of the rise in the number of Asians who want to go to Canada or Australia, or even parts of continental Europe, because in many of those places, at a master's level, education is now available in English.
It's a very good point you're raising, Frieda. I'm glad you mentioned students, because actually shaping the perception of the next generation around the world does begin with students, with who captures the best and the brightest, so to speak. And this is an important point because the decline in the overall number of Chinese and Indian students who either come to the U.S. or remain in the U.S. upon graduation began to decline during the Obama administration in the later years. So it actually predates the Trump administration. Now, obviously, we have the factors of the last couple of years, and you know that he's considering an executive order that would scale back on the H-1B visas as well. So we've already seen for the last few years that America's loss has been Canada's gain when it comes to the best and the brightest. And also Europe is important to mention, because even though many countries in Europe or most are not native English speaking, they have been switching the language of higher education to English and being able to recruit from that global talent pool. So that becomes yet another data point in terms of understanding this kind of mercenary, if you will, mindset of young people around the world who no doubt admire the ideals that America has stood for, and they sympathize with what they're seeing in terms of the Black Lives Matter protests, and even going back to even just the last 10 years, Occupy Wall Street. And I think that there is this...
I'm sorry, I got to stop you. We are out of time. A fascinating conversation, and we will have both of you back. Natalie Nugarat,
partners like Kamala Harris and House members, that would have been poison pills just a month ago. This is a moment in American history where there are things in the Republican bill that allow still chokeholds or no-knock warrants, which are being banned right now from Kentucky to New York. This is not a time for lowest common denominator, watered-down reforms. It's a time to stop the problem, because if someone's knee is on your neck, you can't take it halfway off and say that that's progress. We have the tools with which to stop people from dying. And any bill should have a ban on racial and religious profiling, called for by George Bush in his first address to Congress.
But are you saying on this one particular issue that you will not sign any bill unless there is a reduction that would allow for it to be easier to prosecute bad cops?
Look, I have witnessed in my life the awful criminal justice system getting worse from 1980 till now. Our incarceration going up 500% in America, and it was part of a compromise bill to liberate thousands of people out of prisons. And so I did the best I can, and the first step we did to tear down a system of mass incarceration, which the land of the free has 1 out of every 3 incarcerated women on the planet Earth, even though we're only 5% of the globe's population. So do I want progress? Yes. But when you stop short and start talking about finding a bill that's the lowest common denominator, it is meaning that we will revisit this again when another unarmed black person gets killed and the nation erupts. We should be seeking to solve the problem, pushing the balance of the possible, and getting as big of a coalition as we possibly can.
But you're saying that there is a chance here that this moment you could miss the moment, that Democrats and Republicans won't be able to come to a compromise?
No, I'm saying that we could miss the moment by not solving the problem and ending practices that we know would make a difference to lives. Things like having police misconduct registries open to the public, because sunshine is the best disinfectant. So I'm going to do everything I can in this moment, that is every day, with artists of activism, nonviolent protesters out in the streets every day.
Well, I want to ask you about this moment, because it's an election year and emotions are already supercharged. The president this morning sent a tweet quoting Michael Moore, a filmmaker, said, "Democrats shouldn't underestimate white male Trump supporters' rage and emotion." You heard my exchange with Senator Scott about whether it is ignorance or deliberateness to plan a rally around Juneteenth. Do you believe that you can come to a compromise with this administration on this issue?
Well, this is what I know. I know the heart of Tim Scott and senators like Senator Braun, who said to me he's qualified immunity on the table. We are one body of the United States Senate, and people of good heart and good spirit. Regardless of what the president does, he can veto a bill. But we should come forward in this moment in history, which will be judged. We should put our best faith efforts forward to put a bill intact that will stop the kind of awful violence and killing of unarmed people that we see in our country. We can do that. We know what works. And we know that half measures have not worked in the past, from Ferguson to Minneapolis. We know what will work. This is not a radical bill, but we can get this done.
We will watch. Thank you very much, Senator.
It's
how quickly and how...
An emphasis more on the kind of things we've been seeing in the president's tweets rather than his public speeches.
George, I think that what the president has to do is what comes naturally to him and what he feels in his heart. I think when you're not authentic in today's political world, it's very, very obvious. And I think it's unfair to not point out that this is the president who brought criminal justice and prison reform across this country. And that's an important issue. It was one that I did in New Jersey back.
We need some is associated with
collaborate
now
and being able to actually help.
Absolutely right. And it's good to have that North Star.
Yes, definitely.
Chicago one day, and I
Black man. Well, to be perfectly honest, Damon, when you were showing the video of the body cam and hearing them tussle, I took my earpiece out. When you then narrated the rest of the video with them running through the parking lot, I continued looking away. I could no longer listen to or watch Black people, in this case, an African-American man, being killed by law enforcement. I am thankful that we have video. I am thankful we had video for the killing of Ahmaud Arbery. I'm thankful we had video for the murder of George Floyd. And in a certain way, I'm thankful that we have this video here. But the idea that this is something new, I wish the American people would understand this is something that African Americans have been talking about, yelling about, screaming about, protesting about for generations. And for me personally, really since the killing of Walter Scott in North Charleston, South Carolina, I can no longer listen to the anguish, the pain, the killing of yet another African American who, depending on the circumstances, was just living while Black. You fill in the activity, that's what they were doing. And it has made it really painful in the last few months to just be, to just exist, for the fear that I might rub a Karen the wrong way, or I might rub a law enforcement somebody the wrong way. I live in Washington, D.C. that probably has more law enforcement officials in any jurisdiction in the country, given Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, but also the federal law enforcement that's around here. That is no way to live. And so I hope that yet another video of an unarmed African-American man getting killed by police will add to what looks to be a pivot point in the conversation in this country about what it means to be Black, what it means to be African American, and just to try to live your daily life unmolested. I want to give all of our panelists a chance to also express what they feel. Midwin Charles, give me your reaction to what you've seen and what we're witnessing right now in the wake of another killing of an unarmed Black man in this country at the hands of police.
Well, what I think we are witnessing is, yet again, more and more killing of Black and brown bodies. And frankly, like Jonathan said, I am tired of seeing it. I only watched the video for once. That's my rule now, because I too refuse to be traumatized by these videos. I refuse to allow them to become the norm. And I refuse to allow myself to be desensitized by these videos. It has gotten to the point now where they are replayed over and over and over again. And what I think people tend to forget by these videos is that someone is actually dying. 3 girls lost their father. A son, I believe he also had a stepson. Like, for something that was just not even a serious crime. But I'll tell you, as an attorney, one of the things that's really important here is accountability. What I saw in that video was a crime being committed by that police officer. That police officer murdered that man, just as we saw Derek Chauvin murder George Floyd. We keep seeing police officers murder Black people on video, and they are not held accountable. They're rarely arrested. They're rarely charged. They're rarely prosecuted. And when they are either found not guilty or it's a hung jury. And when they are found guilty, the sentences are minor. And this has to stop. The laws are already on the books. We don't need to create new laws. I know we've had a whole week of legislatures throughout the country coming up with laws to basically tell police officers to stop killing Black people. I don't understand why we need so many additional laws on the books when we have murder, we have manslaughter already on the books in just about every jurisdiction in the United States of America. So that's how I feel about it.
Brittany, let me get your perspective as you and I have spoken so many times over the last couple of weeks, following so many different tragedies. Is this one different in any context whatsoever in the wake of what we've seen over the past several weeks in this country?
I don't know that it matters that it's different circumstantially, because the root of the problem remains the same. And every single time this happens, we go directly into the details of this individual case and that individual case. But here are some things that are true across the board. Black and brown people continue to be disrespected by a country that was built on their backs. Black and brown people continue to be hunted when we are trying to be at rest. Let us remember that Rayshard Brooks was not the first Black person to be called, to have the police called in him while he was sleeping. We've seen that happen at Yale University. He's not the first Black person to be killed by police while he was sleeping. We know that that happened to Breonna Taylor 3 months ago, and there are still no arrests in her case. We know that 7-year-old Aiyana Jones was asleep next to her grandmother in Detroit, Michigan several years ago and was shot by a SWAT team in that city. So we can talk about the details of this all day long. But the truth of the matter is, why do we need to go through every gory detail and see every gory video in order for America to finally believe what Black people have been saying since we've been in this country for 401 years? That our humanity is sacred and it should be respected as such. The truth of the matter is the fact that it takes video and protest and property engagement and worldwide grief in order for people simply to pay attention and for us to maybe get an indictment is an indictment on the system. The fact that it takes all of this for some brands to finally decide that they're going to put up an Instagram post about possibly not being racist and not even beginning to think about being anti-racist, the entire system is indicted. What we are hearing people say right now is they don't care about each detail of every case or how many videos there are to see. What we're hearing people say is that enough is enough, that we've been saying this since we've been here, and that the entire system is rotten at the root. So what we will not abide is consistent incremental changes. Well, the only thing we will abide is the full transformation of systems immediately, because we have to stop dying.
Very powerful words there. Philip, I'm going to pick up on that and take a line from Brittany's comments there, an indictment against the system. What is the indictment against the American system of policing from where you see it, from the academic point of view?
So I'm going to take the point of being here on Zoom privilege to not answer the academic perspective and try and push back on the premise of the question. I don't think Brittany, she can speak in her own words, I don't think she's talking about an indictment of the policing system. I think she's talking about an indictment of the country. I see a nod, so I'm going to keep going.
I surely am.
Yeah, see, this is not just about policing.
Fair enough.
If this were just about policing, right, then we could do some reforms. We could manage the unions. We could, a lot of training would really help. There's some policies we could put into place. That's not what you're hearing from anybody, right? What we're hearing is that there are systems put into place to weaponize white fear of blackness. And it doesn't get weaponized as detention. It gets weaponized as assault and homicide. The system that's being indicted is the fact that there is no amount of evidence that can be brought to bear without me having to be online, in journals, at conferences, talking to people about whether or not there's racial bias in law enforcement against Black people. Let me do this for you. I gave congressional testimony back in September, okay? Gave it twice with a very loud face. And the second time I gave it, I wrote it down, and I had the benefit of a friend and colleague of mine who did a review, very cursory review of the 50 most cited works of police racial bias, right? There's one of those 50 that finds just anti-white bias. One. When we're looking at climate change, right, we say that out of 100 of the top peer-reviewed studies, 98 are dead certain that it's human beings causing climate change. That's the same ratio, for those not doing math. Multiply 50 times 2, you get 100, right? 98 to 2. We have consensus on the science, and people need video evidence. And when there's video evidence, people want to still talk about whether or not it might have been justified based on this particular criminal code. I am exhausted from conversations about justifying homicide, when we're not having conversations about how we create systems that save life. We do that in white communities. We've built societies that are able to do that. We have privatized wealth, privatized social services, privatized policing, so that folks can feel comfortable in their homes and their neighborhoods going back and forth to their job. We can do that. We've been doing that for hundreds of years. But now, I need a signed affidavit, 2 people doing it, 3 different camera angles, right, and some new policies to be able to say that killing me when I was asleep, that's something that we shouldn't do. I'm exhausted from having the conversation. I'm really, really interested in the consensus that we got from the scientific community and the black folks who've been living it, and everybody coming to where we are. But we've been here for a while, and it's time to start moving from this position, not the position of feigned ignorance and deliberate misunderstanding.
Jonathan Capehart, you alluded to something that I think some of our viewers would be interested to know. You used the word Karen. I want you to explain to us what that means, because there is a direct correlation between the kind of viral videos that we're seeing of white people calling the cops on black people, whether it's in the parks or stenciling something on their own property, to the death of black people at the hands of police. What is that line in your eyes?
Well, the perfect Karen for anyone who really wants to understand what that is, Amy Cooper in Central Park, threatening Christian Cooper, no relation, to call the cops, said right to his face, I'm going to call the police and say there's an African-American man threatening me in the park. And then she dials 911 and does it. She knows exactly what she's doing. She knows what the impact of that would be, because we have seen it happen. People call the cops on black people, the cops get there, and then Lord only knows what happens. It could be perfectly fine, or it could go all the way to the person being killed. And so if you want to know what a Karen is, Amy Cooper is a Karen. I think her name is Lisa Alexander in San Francisco. You were alluding to that, Eamon. The guy who was stenciling Black Lives Matter on his own property. And she comes up to him and questions him about why he's doing what he's doing, and then has the nerve to say to him that she knows the people personally who live in the apartment. And then he tells her, go call the cops. Call the cops. I mean, these are the sorts of things that drive us bananas. And if you want to understand the impact of all of these non-lethal viral videos have on African Americans, there's a video that I saw yesterday on Twitter, and it breaks my heart, and I hope I don't start crying as I talk about it. A 6-year-old girl is walking in the park with her mothers, African Americans. Police officer approaches them with the intention of saying hi, and the little girl freaks out, starts crying, and puts her hands up. That's what this country has done to African Americans. That 6-year-old should be able to walk in the park with her mother and not be afraid, and certainly not be afraid of the police. But that's exactly what's happening. And when you see the police officer, you can see her heart is broken to see what her presence in a policeman's uniform has done to that child. It was a female police officer. And so for all of those who are trying to understand whether this is a real thing, or if African Americans are overreacting in terms of the impact of watching all these videos and seeing the news about all these black people being killed by police for a whole host of reasons and issues, take a look at what that 6-year-old girl, she's 6 years old and has her life ahead of her. And she's already afraid of her country. We should be ashamed of that. And we should do something about it now.
Bernie, let me take that question to you. What do we do about it now to prevent young girls like that from being terrorized in our own country at the hands of the police, just at the sight of seeing them?
We do everything about it, and we stop making excuses for all the reasons why we can't. We stop telling people that the word defund scares them. We stop telling people, we stop allowing people to tell us, rather, that the word divestment scares them, when America has been divesting from Black people for a very long time. We make sure that the response is actually commensurate with the harm. Let's be very clear. Black people built this country. Black people gave you your capitalism because we were your first capital. Black people gave you everything in this country that you love and so much more. And the fact that our humanity cannot even be respected while we are laying asleep is a sin. It is, that is the only word for it. It is a sin. It is an absolute violation of every moral code and every religious law and every human law that there is. So the only possible changes, the only things that will actually work are the full transformation of systems, the full investments in our communities that we deserve, and the full changes that are actually reflective of the fact that we are dying. We are not impatient. We are not wrong. We are not unreasonable. We are dying. So your responses, your government responses, the things that mayors and governors and presidents decide to do about this, if it doesn't match the fact that we are dying, then it is not enough, and you need to start over.
Let me play for you, Midwin, a soundbite from Stacey Abrams on ABC this week, where she was asked about defunding the police. Watch this.
What does defunding the police mean to you, and is it necessary?
I think we're being drawn into this false choice idea. The reality is we need two things. We need reformation of how police officers do their jobs, how law enforcement does its job. Because what happened yesterday to Rayshard Brooks was a function of excessive force, and the decision that the fact that they were either embarrassed or panicked led them to murder a man who they knew only had a taser in his hand.
Midwin, do you think that we are looking at this in a false choice, that even members of the media are framing the debate incorrectly? I mean, we're not above criticism. So if you think that we are asking the wrong questions about this debate right now in this country, give me your thoughts. Are we guilty of the way we are framing this conversation?
I think we are. I mean, at the end of the day, like Brittany said, and everybody else on this panel, Black people are dying. And so we need to come to terms with that in this country. Something needs to be done about it. And so if we're going to talk about defunding the police, abolishing the police, then so be it. If those phrases scare people, I do want to remind you that there was a time when Black Lives Matter scared people too. There was a time when just the phrase Black Lives Matter was radical. Can you imagine that? That my life matters freaks people out, just the phrase. So that's where we were a few years ago, and that's not where we are today. So the idea of the phrase defunding the police or abolishing the police, if it scares people, so what? You know what scares people, particularly Black people? The police. Why? As Jonathan just explained, that 6-year-old girl, she saw a police officer and she freaked out. I have to tell you, I'm an attorney, and when I see a police squad car, I freak out too. Because the numbers are there, the video is there, and I think as a country, we have to sort of refrain from this idea that we're scared to talk about things. No one is scared to talk about defunding schools. No one is scared to talk about defunding a whole host of social programs, mental illness programs. No one is scared to talk about defunding programs that provide services for the homeless. So if we can defund those things and have been doing so for decades in this country and no one bats an eyelash, we should be talking about defunding the police. Because what we've seen in the last 2 weeks are police officers in G.I. Joe gear, the latest fashions in G.I. Joe gear, running up and down this country in military tanks when our doctors and nurses had to fit themselves with hefty garbage bags in order to deal with the pandemic. And so when we talk about defunding the police, that is precisely what we are talking about. That's what we're talking about. We cannot rely on the police to solve every single problem in America. If someone is asleep in their car, call a tow truck. Why are you calling 911? that's where we are in this country. And we have to have these conversations. And if it freaks people out, too bad.
Yeah,
Too bad.
we're gonna get to the tow truck tweet in just a moment because it was Philip who tweeted that out that went viral. But Brittany, I want to give you a quick a chance to set the record straight for us. Is it a false choice that we are presenting when we ask the question, is defunding the police necessary, like George Stephanopoulos was asking Stacey Abrams there?
You know, if abolishing slavery was necessary, then we can talk about this. There is a level of courage that this moment is calling every single one of us to. There were systems that were constructed in this country, and when somebody proposed the idea that we should actually treat people not as property, but as people and as human beings, there were lots of folks who said it'll crush the economy. There are a lot of people who said, well, what about my family and my family's jobs? But if your family has built their wealth and their existence on the backs of other people, then it is not only right, but it is our responsibility to dream a different dream. So absolutely, we are creating a false narrative. Instead, we have a responsibility in the media to help educate and bring people into exactly what our most radical imagination can point us toward, because there is a precedent for abolition in this country, and we have to be brave enough to follow it.
Philip, you asked the question like this, and I think in a very poignant way in your tweet. You wrote, you want to know what defunding the police means? It means that Wendy's could have called a tow truck instead of 911, and Rayshard Brooks would be alive tonight. Explain it to our viewers. Explain it to our viewers. What is the connection there? I know it sounds simple, but I want you to explain it to our viewers.
It doesn't take all the imagination in the world to think that there's another way to solve problems, whether it's a dispute in the parking lot, a car that's blocking the exits, any number of the things that don't require armed involvement. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to think about what else could happen. But I gotta say, one of the things that is most distressing to me about the moment we're in right now are the set of replies. I know you're not ever supposed to read the replies on the internet, but if you do, what you'll hear is a bunch of people talking about DUI is a very serious offense, and a tow truck driver is not going to do that. Get real, you idiot, right?
Yeah.
And I'm used to being called an idiot. I'm a professor. I get that from students all the time. But the point is, people are much more invested in debating the minutia than the fact that there's a man who's dead who didn't have to be. Let me say it again. There's a man who's dead who didn't have to be, a father who's dead who didn't have to be. And if we're not willing to start coming up with other solutions, other than calling the police for some of these issues, what we're saying is, I guess maybe some of you just deserve to die. It's okay. It's the cost of doing business. Sometimes black people just deserve to die. And they say in the comments and in my DMs and in the wonderful, lovely, beautifully written emails that I get every morning, they say, well, if he just complied, like George Floyd, that kind of just comply. Well, if he wasn't fighting in the way that he was running away, right? You've been asking us, well, what is there to do? Like, what should all of us be doing right now? And I just want us to focus on the truth. I want us to tell the truth. And the truth is that we've been doing this to black people for hundreds of years. We've been making excuses for why it wasn't our fault, it wasn't the country. The black people were in chains, in red-line neighborhoods, and on the street. We found technical reasons why the law, as if we didn't write the darn laws, why the law was a good reason for them to be dead. And so if there's one thing we can do right now, it's for the first time in American history, we can be honest about American history and what we've been doing to black people since they showed up, without ceasing, without interruption, from 1619 to the present.
Jonathan Capehart, I'm going to give you the final word really quickly. You started off this conversation with a very poignant thought. I'll let you end it for us. The dehumanization of black people continues in this country, as you guys have all eloquently pointed out. It is a fundamental problem. How do we fix it?
Well, you know, I want to end on not such a positive note, but a glimmer of hope note. The fact that we're all here having a very raw, open, honest conversation about this is a glimmer of hope. The fact that there are still people in the streets around America protesting now 2 weeks after the murder of George Floyd and still demanding justice is a glimmer of hope. The fact that a lot of these protests they're multiracial, some of them are majority white. That is a glimmer of hope, because we are not going to move beyond this moment, as it was said before, unless and until the country, and I believe it's a majority of the country that's been silent so far, but has been awakened and is taking to the streets. They see what has happened. They can't look away now. And we, those of us on this panel and those of us watching the show right now, cannot let folks who are awakened, we cannot allow them or let them fall back asleep.
Yeah, I was going to say we can't afford to be silent anymore. Jonathan Capehart, Philip Atiba Goff, Midwin Charles, Brittany Packnett Cunningham. Can't think of a better panel to have for this conversation. Thank you so much, all. Jonathan, we're going to see you in a little bit on the show. Don't go anywhere. More AM Joy just after the break.
That's not what those words really mean in this context. And then a bunch of people on the left said, actually, that is precisely what it means. And the New York Times ran a column to that effect this weekend saying we literally want to take money, all money, away from police departments, which I would argue could be more dangerous if implemented than an op-ed from Tom Cotton, but what do I know?
Right, that was an op-ed contributor to the Times. Ray, Joe Biden was asked about this on CBS News. Let's take a look.
I think if you take defund the police literally, it is an insanely radical and impractical proposal.
We should not get caught up in the word. We should get clear about the demand. And the demand is for transformation of policing.
You obviously didn't see Joe Biden there. Can I have that soundbite, please?
Do you support defunding the police?
No, I don't support defunding the police. I support conditioning federal aid to police based on whether or not they meet certain basic standards of decency and honorableness.
So, Ray, with Joe Biden saying he doesn't support defunding the police, but with the Trump team trying to sort of tar him with it by saying that many people around him and many Democrats do, the journalists have to make these distinctions.
Well, if the presumptive Democratic nominee for president says he doesn't believe it, I don't think I can side with Guy in finding it more significant than an op-ed columnist in the New York Times did. Opinion plots across a broad continuum, all the way from, yes, literally ending policing, to something that looks a little bit more like the police reform that came out of the 1960s and 70s. It is all over the place, but elected officials have been very cautious so far.
But Ray, just quickly, there's a new YouGov poll that shows Democrat voters split almost down the middle on the proposition of defunding the police. That's a sea change, and that's significant in my opinion.
All right, let me get Jillian back in just briefly. Police reform is the hot story right now, but when the protests fade and the 24/7 coverage fades, that could fade as well. Your thoughts?
Yeah, it will. I also don't think in this instance it's journalist or the media writ large's fault for the discrepancy, the debacle over the word defund. I think the core of the problem there is that the activists who chose this name are themselves divided. Some of them want the police defunded entirely. Some of them only want the police force's budget transformed, whatever you want to call it. That's what the media's coverage is reflecting here. We can't hang on.
I'm just trying to make...
Guy mentioned the New York Times op-ed. It was an op-ed saying we really want the police to be completely defunded. That's not what all the activists want. They need to coalesce around a strategy themselves.
All right. We will continue this conversation on the other side. But first, the Seattle Times has criticized a photo collage on the Fox News website involving the autonomous zone set up by protesters in that city, calling it a mashup of different pictures taken on different days. An editor's note says the collage did not clearly delineate between these images and since has been replaced. In addition, a recent slideshow depicting scenes from Seattle mistakenly included a picture from St. Paul, Minnesota. Fox News regrets these errors, and these errors are unfortunate on such a sensitive subject. Ahead, Chris Wallace weighs in on whether major news organizations are being pushed to the left. But first, the press calls it a conspiracy theory as the president tweets about the alleged police assault on a 75-year-old Buffalo protester.
If you have a garden,
deserve the truth that has been completely debunked, but your network is not credible enough and is not a legitimate enough network to actually take responsibility for your errors and to issue corrections like this poll
Lots of
and
people
like
have
this
lots of
factually false
opinions.
statement.
That's one of the
If
wonderful
you
things
were
about America.
interested
Lots
in
of opinions.
opinions,
The Supreme Court has long
but
said
not a
that
factually
a
false
major
statement.
purpose of the
Do you know
First
the
Amendment is to
difference, Brian?
protect the free discussion of government affairs, including discussions of candidates.
Of course it
the
is.
opinion articles that you're
Discussion is
describing do exactly that. So why do you think you're
It's
right
a
and the Supreme
factually
Court is
false
wrong?
statement. Do you know the difference, Brian? Do you know the difference between a factually false statement and an opinion statement?
I do. Is
you know
your
the
goal really to loosen up the libel laws? President
Okay,
Trump's talked about
so-
wanting to do that.
So
Is
then,
the real
if
goal
someone
to
published
loosen
a
up the
factually
libel laws
false
in America?
statement, why are you calling it an opinion statement? Why are
It's
you
an
calling
opinion
it a factually
article.
false
It was
statement
published
an
on
opinion
CNN's
statement?
opinion website.
No, so you think it's okay? Do you think it's okay to put a factually false statement inside of an opinion piece and couch it in an opinion piece when it is a factually provably false statement? Is that okay with you as a journalist?
I think it's really inappropriate for campaigns to sue news outlets in order to get publicity in
No, you
order
didn't
to
answer my
advance an
question. Do you
anti-media
think that
agenda.
you don't want to be held accountable? Do you want to be a legitimate
I love
journalist?
being held
or do you
accountable
want to be
every
an
day
activist?
by
This is
everybody,
why.
by every viewer,
Okay,
and,
then
and
why
by
aren't you
everybody else.
why aren't you taking responsibility
Because it wasn't
for
my
junk
piece. It
science
wasn't my
poll
opinion
and
piece.
also for factually false statements? But do you agree with the general principle that you shouldn't, as a journalist, put a factually false statement in an opinion piece? That's not protected by the First Amendment. That's why we have libel laws and defamation laws. Would you agree with that?
Okay, so I'm not going to, let you flip the
Would
tables
you?
and let you interview me.
Oh, you're,
I'm going to leave it to
no,
CNN's lawyers about that
because you
opinion
can't answer
piece.
that. You know, Brian, that is not protected by the First Amendment. You won't answer that simple question. As a journalist, don't you have
It
the
is protected by the
integrity to
First
actually
Amendment.
answer that question, Brian?
Opinion pieces
A
are
false and
protected by the
defamatory
First
statement.
Amendment.
No, that's not. Don't spin that,
Hey,
Brian.
I'll tell you what.
Answer the
I'll tell you what.
question.
Let's
Do
see
you
what
think
happens
as a
in court.
journalist,
Let's see what happens in court. We're not going to litigate it here.
are you
It's going to be
willing to
litigated
put
in
your
court.
reputation-
That's what you all want, right?
That's a very easy question.
You all want this
That's
litigated
a very
in
easy
court.
question, Brian.
Let's see
the
what
only
happens
reason
in
we
court.
have to go to court and hold you accountable is because you're unwilling to have the integrity to actually say that a factually provably false statement should never appear on the pages of any in any newspaper or media outlet around the country. That should be something so easy. I mean, didn't you learn?
A course in his life when he's ready to meet God.
Feeling as I did about Bill, but now, in view of what Bob has told me, I'm more at a loss than ever.
The judgment and forsaketh not his saints. They are preserved forever, but the seed of the wicked shall be cut off.
Well,
and more.
And the path of the economy.
While he lies to the public on Twitter. I'm just curious, that's the strategy, right? He went out there and he lied about that Buffalo Peace activist.
You said
He
you're
watched-
fine.
Yeah.
You said
So
you're
he
fine
watched-
being held accountable.
The president the other day watched One American News. He saw a lie on One American News about a conspiracy theory about Antifa. He got excited by that lie and he tweeted it to millions of people. So why do you say he's about truth and facts
Brian.
when he's spreading lies about peace
Brian,
activists
he
in
is
Buffalo?
all about truth and facts.
He's
He is
not,
all
Jenna.
about
Jenna,
truth
that's
and
a
facts,
you're
and
wasting
he's
my
about
time,
holding-
Jenna.
So he has.
He's not.
So, Brian,
Jenna,
you're the one who invited
the
me
idea that the
on
president
to
cares
talk
about
this,
truth and
you won't
facts.
we can't even agree. We can't even agree on what's fact right now. This is the problem.
Of what they receive, we receive.
To actually have a legitimate point of truth that we can agree on and then proceed from there. That.
There's a book that I'd like to give you. Meet and get everything covered and everything taken care of. And when it's a great...
Because she has different perspective. And that's why we're suing you over the factually false statement.
Right, so we
But
talked
this
about
is
the
why
opinion
fake
piece.
news is
Are you
so
also going to sue over the poll?
No,
Are
but
you
this
also
is
going to
why,
sue over the poll?
because
You're not going to sue over the poll. That's
we're
my
holding
prediction.
you
Let
accountable.
me ask you, Jenna, about what the president tweeted yesterday.
And
This was a
started
clear
with-
abuse of
with
power
the
by
letter,
President
and if
Trump.
you had been willing, let me answer. If you are willing to actually correct your misleading junk science poll, then we wouldn't have
It was
to go
not a
through this. That's
misleading
why
junk
you
science
start. By the way,
poll.
this is and again, you asked the legal strategy. This is why the very first step. I know that you're not aware of this, but the very first step in how we conduct business.
Raises the question: what are you hiding? Why did you
take the position and blatantly lie to counsel for the family that there was something that was going to compromise your investigation, when in fact, when I actually get the remainder of the video, none of the things that you say are going to be there are there. And we're supposed to trust that this is an impartial and fair investigation. You have the state police being investigated by the state attorney, and there's all of this foul play from what I can see at this point, and we're supposed to trust this process as being independent. This is just not right. There needs to be an independent prosecutor.
Yeah, let me just pick up on that point real quick. First of all, thank you very much for providing that very important context.
I think is preposterous.
Antifa, and there was no evidence at the time showing that he was Antifa. So the president of the United States should have a higher threshold.
Agreed. Fully agree.
Okay, well, I just wanted to go to Rayshard because, as Jillian mentioned, Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany said he has the right to ask those questions, and of course he does. But not providing any specific evidence of it is, I think, what is fueling a lot of the media outrage.
Well, the press secretary's answer was clearly disingenuous and an attempt to deflect. I doubt in their wargaming the president's messaging in the media shop, they rubbed their hands together in glee on him blasting out OAN conspiracy theory reporting that has no basis in fact, that makes him look callous and dismissive of a man who was clearly injured. It was not a win for the president, and, you know, presidential prestige and presidential credibility is a real thing, and you don't want to fritter it away on something like this. Some days I just can't believe it, right?
Years, if we just sit down and talk about this, you're going to recognize how damaging it was. How damaging it was to use terms like fake news, to attack journalists who were trying to do their jobs.
In 15 or 20 years, you're not trying to do your job. You're not a journalist, Brian. You're an activist. That's the problem. You have an agenda, and your agenda is anti-Trump. The American people see through that, and they are very grateful that this president is finally holding the fake news media accountable, because you're activists. You're not reporting fact and truth. You won't even say that as a general
the reason why I think it's helpful to have these conversations
shouldn't ever appear in a media outlet.
Folks have gotten used to this alternative realities, and I think it's important we see there are alternative realities. And Jenna, I appreciate you coming on to talk.
How can you as a journalist sit there, Brian, and you know what? I want to
One
wish
more bit of Trump news to share with you.
happy birthday from CNN.
Happy birthday. One more bit of Trump news before the break. You can expect to see
safe with my family, working hard.
Hello, Topper. Use the promo code to save 30%.
Cut! Sonny.
There, as it relates to policing and the black and brown community, there has to be a dramatic, drastic change and an effort put into changing this behavior. And it really is going to take a lot of us coming together and getting on the same page.
It certainly is, Martin. What makes me so sad is that, as I said, you and I have been having these conversations for years, and we're still having these conversations. I would have hoped we would have moved on by now, but clearly we have not. Martin Luther King III, thank you, as usual, for joining us. Good luck.
Thank you.
And stay safe. We're looking at these live pictures coming in from Washington, D.C. right now. The protesters, they're marching. Unclear to me where they're heading, but we're going to check in to see what's going on. We're also going to check in with the first African-American mayor of Montgomery, Alabama, and we'll discuss how to keep the peace while not quitting at all on this effort to achieve justice
for all. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
You're telling people that Liberty Mutual customizes your insurance, so you only pay for what.
.com/TV or call 1-888-5-PURPLE.
Mississippi River.
What was the population like?
The population was gaining rapidly. I was only 2 or 3 million.
In order to help my community become better, I have to forgive myself.
JB in Toledo, Ohio.
Yes, thanks for taking the call, and thanks to the innovative Brian Lamb. Yes, I would like to ask a couple of questions. One of the brother, what does he think of George G.M. James? And two, does he think the
Career has been redeemed.
Have more vitamins and less saturated.
Media figures, sports figures, and so forth. Does that kind of hypocrisy, again, somebody like you who's come out of an inner city environment, does that kind of hypocrisy frustrate you?
Well, the poverty that I came out of was a rural poverty, and what I've noticed, you know, as a student and as a faculty member, is that a lot of people who have been privileged, whether they're white, black, or Hispanic, the more privileged they are, the more they feel the need, you know, to use that language of systemic racism. And I think it's being driven by guilt. They feel guilty because they're prospering. And it's very problematic to me that the people who make public policy, a lot of them have degrees from Ivy League schools. They went to Ivy League schools and prep schools. They know nothing about the topics they're trying to solve. So maybe they did research. They were in a PhD program. They wrote a dissertation. That's the extent of their knowledge, and they're going to make public policy for the nation. That's one of the reasons that we're in trouble. And all these theories that they put forth, the critical theory, critical feminist theory, critical race theory, all of that's rooted in Marxism, and it's a false narrative, and it has no relationship to truth or reality.
And this word Marxism, the fact is the Antifa group, which has done enormous damage to inner city communities over the last couple of weeks, is a Marxist anarchist group. The media pretends that they don't exist or they downplay their role. Black Lives Matter, in many respects, is a very violent group and an anti-Semitic group, at least during its founding, part of the BDS movement. That's never mentioned. People say they stand with Black Lives Matter. We stand for the lives of black people and all people. We do not necessarily, the world, certainly not I, stand with this organization per se. Let me ask you this. School choice, education is key. Education has been key throughout your life. You're a highly educated woman. In our inner cities, the kind of choice that we have in the rest of the country does not exist. We have an all-powerful labor union, a public sector union called the National Education Association and the American Federation of Teachers. They are tied at the hip with the Democrat Party. They are huge donors to the Democrat Party, nearly exclusively, and they work hand in glove. Barack Obama was one of the most outspoken and ardent opponents of school choice, which would allow for America, the parents of poor kids, especially in violent communities or in communities with bad schools and minority communities, to choose working quality schools to send their kids rather than the school down the street if it's not functioning properly, and allows competition, parochial schools, private schools, charter schools, and so forth, where the money follows the student, just as the money follows the student in college. This, to me, is a huge human and civil rights issue, basic education. The NBA is not behind it. The NFL is not behind it. The media are not behind it. Hollywood's not behind it. The Democrat Party, like so often in our history, is obstructing it. And they talk about the cops' unions. What about the teachers' unions? What's your take on this?
Well, I can tell you that the public opinion polls that I've seen, majorities of blacks and Hispanics want school choice. And it makes a lot of sense because the people who are making decisions for them, they have school choice. And in those inner city schools, they're crime ridden. Students are afraid to go to school. because of the quote restorative justice rooted in Marxism, and it is making it almost impossible for students to be suspended. And in cities that are run by Democrats, they have not gotten rid of that. And so there's lawlessness within the schoolhouse. The teachers are afraid to teach. There's chaos in school just like it is on the streets. And I think that that's very problematic, and we need school choice, and we need to hold public schools accountable. And whenever Democratic cities want money, they say we have to pay our teachers more. They use the teachers, but a lot of that money never reaches the teachers. It's used for administrative purposes.
The problem is, in these Democrat cities, they have an economic model that is more socialist than capitalist.
Yes.
They have an all-powerful bureaucracy, and they do not allow these kids to get a proper education. The money keeps flowing through the same routes, and it does not work. You want true revolutionary change, true drastic reform, you got to remove these barriers. A one-party rule of the public sector teachers union, and bring in more liberty and opportunity and prosperity and education and choice in the communities that haven't seen it in half a century. Doctor, I want to thank you very, very much for being on the program, and God bless you.
Thank you.
We'll be right back.
Need to actually do that work. This is about fully funding public safety. Now, what we've seen is continuing budgets of increase in law enforcement year after year, where in the city of Louisville, for instance, the budget for law enforcement is more than all the other city agencies combined. And then we see that at the state level, and we certainly see that at the federal level with our military-industrial complex. Our law enforcement are dressed up as militarized organizations that treat us as enemy combatants. What we're saying is, instead of continuing to put tax dollars into creating this organization or this effort that doesn't keep us safe, that we actually put money into the community, that we do the work of community policing, we do the work of mental health, we do the work of dismantling and disrupting poverty. And we need men and women in law enforcement to join us in doing that work. And so, I've led for that for years. I come from the poor zip code in Kentucky. We criminalize poverty in Kentucky. And the only way we will change that is if we put people at the front of our agenda and not at the bottom of our knee or our foot. And I'm proud to stand with Kentuckians to demand real change.
One more question before I let you go. Have you seen any signs on the ground or as you've been campaigning that suggests to you that Mitch McConnell is afraid of running against you? Or do you think that he still sees drawing you in a general election as the better draw, if you will?
Mitch McConnell is terrified of facing me because he knows I'm everything he's not. He does not understand people. He will not inspire anyone. He does not speak to our issues. He has ignored and abandoned us, and he knows that I will take the fight right to him. I'm not going to play games and say I'm a pro-Trump Democrat. I'm not going to wait for consultants to tell me what to think. I'm going to speak the truth, and I'm firing up people that even supported Donald Trump that are saying, Charles, even if we disagree with you on things, we know you're going to fight for us. So we're standing with you. Mitch McConnell can't handle that, and we will absolutely beat him, and he knows it.
All right, well, I guess we may get the chance to find out. Charles Booker, thank you very much for coming on the program tonight. It's great to have you. We'll be watching your race really closely.
You know what's better than mopping? Anything. At the end of the
Federal buildings in the United States. We're going to go inside the effort to rename military bases and force Confederate figures once and for all out of the U.S. Capitol that they once seceded from.
I'm Ray. We've been fighting the war on drugs for
to protect those wolves.
Looking at College Board data just a couple of years ago. So the black story in America is not a story of tragedy. But when you look at things that are genuinely problematic at a large scale in the black community, I think you're seeing legacies of racism in the past, i.e. you're looking at poverty, housing, so on down the line. And even more to the point, to me, you're seeing legacies of the 1960s welfare state Fatherlessness, for example, is the biggest problem. I'm not just going to blame black people here. The biggest problem among all groups in America. The great economist Walter Williams in 1938 looked at rates of fatherlessness for whites, as I recall, that was under 4%. For African Americans, it was 11%. Those same rates today are 35.4% for Caucasians, including Caucasian Hispanics, over 50%, close to 60% for Hispanics and Native Americans, 72% for African Americans. And obviously, the presence of a father, and particularly a young man's life, is one of the biggest predictors of how well he's going to do in high school, how likely he is to go to jail, things like suicide. That's especially true, by the way, for lower-income Caucasian Americans. So I think there are very broad systemic problems in the black community and in many American communities. I would say the collapse of the family and the things associated with this, small business community, social sector, probably the biggest one. Why is it so tempting to blame the ghosts of the past? I think to some extent, two reasons. One, we're used to doing so, and two, there is broad social approval. So, I mean, celebrities, LeBron James, for example, know that if they say the cause of every one of these problems, such as fatherlessness or the test score gap, is racism, one, that is going to be greeted very approvingly by a network of natural allies throughout society, and two, it will sound like something that most people are used to hearing. But dealing with the actual problems in African American communities and other communities is going to take more than the eradication of racism. And it's worth noting, by the way, that the large majority of people, black and white, are not racist in any conventional sense today. We might look at the results on some complex implicit bias test and be a little worried for a bit, but if you look at actual classic questions, would you vote for a qualified member of the other race for president if they ran with your political party? The figure for that's 92% for African Americans and for whites. Well over 80% of people support interracial dating, marriage, love. So I don't think we can simply look at an issue like violence in cities and say, well, that's due to racism. One thing you have to point out is that many of the large cities in the United States of America have been controlled by Democratic, often minority-led administrations for decades. So if there is a problem with the schools in Detroit or with gun violence in the streets, you can't necessarily just say, well, that's the white man.
Mm-hmm. And also, on this interracial issue you raised, I looked at statistics based on a few years back, and it indicated that new marriages, 17% or almost 1 in 5 are interracial. Now, how can you have systemic racism? One out of every 5 marriages is interracial, and the other statistics you provide. Say, I could be wrong about this, and I'd like to pose this to you for the next segment. This notion of systemic racism means everything and means nothing. It's an excuse for not addressing the real issues that exist in these communities and other communities. You pointed out one-party rule, one-party ideology, one-party economic ideology. So there's a battle. There are obstacles to things like school choice that exist in other parts of the country, but not in the inner cities. You have the Democrat Party that has opposed this. As I said earlier in the show, Barack Obama led the battle against school choice in many of these communities. And so if you're going to have truly revolutionary and radical ideas, you have to have competition politically, competition in schools, and opportunities. I'd like your thought on that when we return. We'll be right back.
Hey, that's totally him. That's totally the
investments, changes in the way our economy works would make a tremendous difference.
Well, there's talk now, as you know, Mr. Secretary, of another $2 trillion economic package focusing in on manufacturing, among other things. But do you think there's bipartisan support right now to take the steps you're advocating?
I don't, and that's unfortunate. The House Democrats passed a $3 trillion package that I think would do an immense amount to help people who've been most disadvantaged by the pandemic, but it will only really address the problems that are caused by the pandemic. It's not going to get at the larger systemic challenges that we face. And in the Senate, Senate Majority Leader McConnell has really made no move to propose any additional help. For example, the Democrats have proposed $1 trillion for local and state governments. Senator McConnell has said that he doesn't want to see any additional money going to state governments. He'd rather see them declare bankruptcy. That will cause immense pain in communities around the country, and it will result in even more public sector workers losing their jobs. 1.5 million public sector workers have lost their jobs in the last 2 months. We need to recover from that if we're going to see the economy recover overall.
You're absolutely right. Mr. Secretary, thanks so much for joining us. Seth Harris, the former acting labor secretary. Appreciate it very much. Good luck.
Thanks, Wolf.
All right, coming up, the NBA star Dwight Howard caught
time slots so you can get your groceries when you need them.
the former NBA star Caron Butler. He's standing by live. We'll discuss that and more as we see these protests continuing in Washington, in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Atlanta. Much more of our coverage right after this.
He drew a line in the sand saying that, and he has the right to say this, and I think a lot of people feel this way as well, as you see Kyrie Irving and so many more just explaining that, look, we feel like our energy and our efforts should be still with the social injustice, with the systemic racism and all those things. And, you know, I echo those sentiments. You know, I think it's very important that we keep our energy and our focus on that. However, the game and playing in Orlando, the NBA has already went full steam ahead with making that happen, and the announcement came out. But you can understand his emotions, his feelings, and I feel the same way right now.
Yeah, I know you were involved also with LeBron James' More Than a Vote campaign, Caron. It's focusing in on energizing black voters. Do you think the protests will lead to increased turnout, for example, in November?
Absolutely. I think the momentum has to continue, and I'm so glad you brought that up, Wolf. When you think of More Than a Vote, it really is that. And collectively, you know, I've been working with the Vcr Institute for quite some long, and we've been addressing mass incarceration, immigration reform, and all those things in our respective space. However, collectively, it is a we thing, and we have to come together to move the needle on this thing. So with myself, LeBron James, Kerry Champion, Jamel Hill, Skylar Diggins, and so many more across the nation, everyone's engaged, and we're just trying to make sure that we use our platform to, one, educate and inform, properly inform, and then make sure that not just on the county level and city level, but the state level and ultimately up top, you know, at the presidential level, that we have a true impact.
More Than a Vote is supposed to provide black voters around the country, Caron, with the ability to make their voices heard at the polls. How do you turn the energy behind the protests that we've been seeing in cities all over the country into direct action?
Well, I think that you continue to inform and educate, as I just touched on, you know, pivoting to one of the biggest thing and hardest things for a long time is to convince, you know, young people that you have to have sweat equity in this space. You have to show up and show out. You have to exercise your right to vote. And sometimes things don't go your way and you're kind of deflated by the result and the outcome. But now seeing the state of our world, seeing the state of our economy, seeing the circumstances with the policing and seeing the outcomes, it is not good for us right now, and we have to drive real change. And I love the energy that you see on the front line throughout the states, nationwide, globally, with the protesting. And now we have to take that same energy into November and collectively exercise our right to vote and move the needle.
Finally, before I let you go, Caron, in your article in the Players Tribune, you write, and I'm quoting you now, anyone without something real to say by now, as far as I'm concerned, that means they're part of the problem. What do you want NBA fans to say to the owners, the commissioner, Adam Silver, and to the country right now?
I mean, look, it's beyond being politically correct, and I stated that in the article. This is a we thing. In our community, in the black community, in the Hispanic community, in the Latinx community, we've all collectively came together, but we're going to need more people that, you know, that comes from different walks of life to understand, one, the circumstances and, you know, the trauma that, you know, us as black people been through all these years that continue to get swept under the rug and address those traumas and those issues and really come out and vote. And one last thing, Wolf, when you look at the world that we live in, there is an arrest made every 3 seconds in the United States. That's 10 million people per year. So that is a real issue. So we don't want to continue to have the same outcomes.
All right, Karan, good luck to you. Karan Butler joining us here in the Situation Room. Thanks very much.
Thank you, brother.
So Denny Hamlin already at second spot. car, William Byron.
Also have the ability and I think the responsibility to speak our values and speak our truth here about how we need to invest in communities, how we need to make sure that law enforcement is building relationships with the community and does not have an adversarial one. Everyone needs to be on the same team in Michigan, so we can certainly set that standard and those values. We need to work with the Michigan legislature, and the Michigan Senate took an important step a week and a half ago when they passed a significant set of reforms to the MCOL's body that we've been talking about for the last couple of minutes. This body will now add de-escalation training as a requirement. We'll put in place a continuing education requirement because law enforcement professionals are professionals. They need to be treated just like teachers or engineers or doctors. You have to keep honing your craft and getting better at your job. And so we're certainly working with the legislature to the extent that we can. Criminal justice reform has been a bipartisan issue of consensus in Michigan, certainly for the last 2 years. And I think that we can do more in partnership with them. But in the meantime, we're checking out all the authority that we have as well.
What's your relationship like with police unions across the state? Do you think that they can be an ally in this fight?
I think everyone has a role to play to fixing this broken system and broken set of relationships. And that includes police unions that, they represent officers, but those officers are members of communities. And everyone in our community needs to have empathy for the people who have a genuine and justified fear of any interaction with law enforcement. I could say that personally as someone who's had negative interactions with law enforcement since I was 14 years old, as a black teenager and now as a black man. So we all have a role to play, and I think police unions need to step up to the plate just like everybody else.
All right, Lieutenant Governor Garland Gilchrist, thank you very much for your time as always. And we are thinking also amid the coronavirus pandemic of everyone struggling in your state. I know you guys have been pretty hard hit. So unfortunately, we don't have any more time to talk about that because it does do it for us tonight here on KCDC. We're going to be back with you next week.
Voting Rights Act that prohibited denial or restriction of the right to vote. It forbids discriminatory voting practices nationwide. 1967, you had the Loving versus Virginia Act declares state laws prohibiting interracial marriage to be unconstitutional. Going back, in 1953, Dwight Eisenhower instituted rules that eliminated discrimination in government contracting. He desegregated federal government and the nation's capital. 1957, the Civil Rights Act of 1957, it created the Civil Rights Commission, it created the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. 1957 and 59, Eisenhower ordered desegregation of the Washington, D.C. public schools. You had the Insurrection Act that was amended in 1871 to allow the use of military to enforce, among other things, civil rights and desegregation. 1871, Ulysses S. Grant sent 1,000 soldiers to hunt down Klansmen in South Carolina, and they captured 600 of them. 1957, Eisenhower sent the 101st Airborne Division to Little Rock protect 9 black students entering Little Rock Central High School against the order of the governor at the time, Orville Forbes, one of Bill Clinton's mentors, by the way. 1962, John Kennedy federalized the National Guard to allow a black student to enroll in classes at the University of Mississippi, Oxford. 1965, LBJ federalized the National Guard to protect civil rights marches headed for Selma to Montgomery. I'm just touching the tip of the iceberg. The number of economic programs, the trillions of dollars, and so don't tell me this country is systemically racist. If this country were systemically racist, none of this would have taken place. None of this would be taking place. We Americans are good people, regardless of our race, regardless of our religion, regardless of our sex, regardless of the politicians who try to divide us, the media who try to divide us, these so-called cultural icons who try to divide us. We're an imperfect people in an imperfect country, but it is the greatest country on the face of the earth. Just ask most of those who are on TV, who are in sports, or in Hollywood, who trash it day in and day out. If you want real, revolutionary, dramatic reforms, including in our inner cities, then abandon the old economic practices. Allow choice, allow liberty to take place in these communities. They are ruled by one party, iron-fisted control. And the politicians that run these towns, as far as I'm concerned, are corrupt.
Gillette Skin Guard. It has a guard between the blades that helps.
One smart business owner talks to another, collaboration happens. And
Francisco Mayor London Breed and Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot. They are each on the front lines of the two enormous struggles that Americans are facing right as we speak: racism and the coronavirus. And over the next hour, they'll be taking questions from people all across the United States who are critically engaged in these important issues. But first, let's take a look at how each of these leaders have met this moment. 4 U.S. mayors, 4 different cities, all dealing with a country in crisis.
Black Lives Matter, Black Humanity Matters.
Protests spread across the U.S. after another death of a black man at the hands of a police officer in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
All my life, I have fought with every fiber of my being to survive in a world that was built to throw flaming roadblocks in our way.
As mayor, it doesn't mean that I'm immune from feeling the hurt and the pain.
It's going to be incumbent upon all of us to be able to get together and articulate more than our anger.
The anger, according to activists, is over how police operate. Propped up by a system that they say has devalued black lives for far too long.
There's a lot of distrust of police and the government. There are people who are craving to be heard.
Being sick and tired of being sick and tired.
It's so important that we follow through on the commitment for the investments in black and brown neighborhoods.
But this isn't the only crisis these mayors are facing. A pandemic is still very much alive in their cities, and mass gatherings like the protests we've seen over the past weeks may have dire consequences.
We don't know what the impact of these demonstrations will be on our COVID experience in D.C.
Black Americans are among the most affected by this disease.
People of color are getting hit harder.
There's no sugarcoating this. The numbers are going to get worse before they get better.
We took the step before any other cities to declare a state of emergency.
4 mayors, all wading through uncharted waters.
There's something better on the other side of this for us, and there's something better on the other side of this for our children's children.
I can't tell you how excited I am to speak to each of you ladies tonight. I'm so intrigued by each of you, and it's very clear just how multifaceted each one of you is. And I have a funny feeling that each one of us knows what it's like to be at times feeling powerless and knowing the importance of speaking truth to power. But here you are, all each in a position of power, and I can't wait to hear you speak tonight to the nation. So thank you all for joining. And Mayor Bottoms, I'd like to start with you. You know, just this weekend, another incident captured on video of a black man dying at the hands of police, and it happened in your city of Atlanta when Mr. Rayshard Brooks was killed just Friday night. Now, the Atlanta police chief has resigned. The officer responsible, you know, has been fired. So what are you saying to people right now who are shocked, who are angered, who are sick and tired of being sick and tired of seeing yet another police killing before we've even had a chance to really catch our breath over what happened to people like George Floyd? Here we are in the midst of another protest. What do you say to them?
Laura, this has been hard, and it is really been difficult for me to put aside my own anger and sadness during this time and really be able to articulate what our communities need to hear, because the reality is, what can you say? I watched the body cam video. I watched it for 30 minutes. I watched the interaction with Mr. Brooks, and it broke my heart when he talked about his daughter's birthday party that he was planning for. This was not confrontational. This was a guy that you were rooting for. And even knowing the end, watching it, you're going, just let him go, just let him go. Let him call somebody to pick him up. And I think that's the challenge that we're all facing as leaders right now. People are looking to us to lead, but when these things continue to happen over and over again, we're asking ourselves the same questions. How do we lead during this time? We had just convened an advisory committee awaiting recommendations in 2 weeks on how we look at our use of force policies. And not even 3 days into this advisory committee before I can even get a report, we have a deadly shooting in Atlanta. And the only thing that I can call upon right now are the things that we have called upon historically. And that's just this reminder that we will get to the other side of this. But in the meantime, we got to keep pushing. And it's I know it doesn't matter to the families because their loved ones are gone, but just for them to understand that these deaths will not be in vain. There's a movement across this country and it is changing all of our cities.
You know, when I saw you or heard you say that about rooting, it got me in my stomach, and I saw every one of you mayors react to that notion of watching this and hoping for a different outcome, even knowing what was ahead. And I want to turn to our first question. It comes from Bree Gamble in Hampton, Georgia, and her former partner is Javier Ambler. Now, he died while being arrested in Austin, Texas in March, not of this year, but last year. But the video of that arrest was just released last week. I want to ask Mayor Bowser, here's her question for you.
He was not just a co-parent, he was also one of my best friends. And now that he's gone due to police brutality, how will you make sure that these officers are held to the highest punishment possible for deaths, beatings, and mistreatment of citizens, especially when it's racially motivated? When will their positions be held in a higher standard than citizens when they commit these crimes?
Mayor Bowser?
Well, thanks for that question. And I think certainly you and the viewer is talking about accountability. And what we have tried very hard in Washington, D.C. to do as we've been reforming our police department over the last 18 years is build in tools of accountability. And in 2015, for example, we outfitted all of our officers, all of our patrol officers with body-worn camera. And it's so important for accountability for the officers and for the public. But it's also important that mayors, police chiefs also have tools to make sure when there's police misconduct, when there is a fatal shooting, when there is a use of force, that we have as mayors and police chiefs the ability to quickly institute discipline for officers all the way up through firing. And it's also very important that prosecution happens, and it's not the mayor's decision whether a officer is prosecuted. So making sure that we're also holding our prosecuting officers responsible is important. And in DC, we have an extra wrinkle in that because those prosecutors are federal.
You know, I was one of those federal prosecutors in your own city, and so when you're talking about accountability, I'm glad to hear about the holistic approach. And you know, Mayor Breed, if I can bring you in here, because I want this to be a conversation. The public does not want you interviewed. We want to hear from each of you and all of your dynamism in this context. Each of you brings something so unique about your perspective. And Mayor Breed, you know, you're somebody who has been consistently arguing for wraparound services, a holistic approach. It's never just been, right, about just a criminal prosecution in one instance.
Yeah, it definitely isn't, because we know that there are a number of challenges disproportionately, sadly, in this country historically that African Americans have faced. And we know that we see, even in liberal San Francisco, in many cases we see African Americans who oftentimes are somehow the ones who are pulled over mostly by police officers here. And so one of the things that I am pushing for now is to make sure that police are not responding to those calls that don't involve violence. Why is it that if someone's painting in front of their home or doing some sort of chalk drawing that all of a sudden the police need to be involved. And in many cases, when it's an African American, things can escalate. We have to hold our departments accountable, but also the bias training and the things that we do around hiring officers, we have to make sure that people who are racist, that people who have problems with working with black people in some capacity, or may have never been around a black person in their entire life, they should not be working in communities where they may engage with African Americans, which could lead to some of the situations that we're seeing all over our country.
I mean, from San Francisco, where you don't have a large population considered the old population of African Americans, but you certainly do have the same disparate treatment of communities of color. But Mayor Lightfoot, you have a far more sizable population of communities of color in Chicago. What do you say to this issue of police accountability and what needs to be done?
Well, if I may, what I first want to do is I want to acknowledge Ms. Gamble's pain. You can tell by her voice that she's still very much suffering and traumatized from the experience. And I think one of the things that's most important in this moment is that we don't forget that there are real live people who have lost their lives as a result of police violence, and their families continue to live in that pain. And I want to make sure that we don't forget that. I've spent some time over the last couple days, and including today, talking to people that I've gotten to know, surviving family members, and they're feeling a lot of re-trauma through this experience. They feel lost, they feel hopeless, they feel pained, and in some instances, they feel voiceless. And we need to make sure that as we talk about these larger issues, that we never lose sight of the fact that someone has lost a loved one, and that person continues to feel that pain. So yes, we absolutely have to address this issue. The status quo is clearly failing, even in cities like Chicago and others across the country where we've been working on reform issues for a number of years now. We have to accelerate the pace of that and really give voice to the pain and the anguish that we're seeing out on the streets every single day. People are sick of rhetoric. They're sick of talk. They want concrete action. And as mayors, that's what we've got to do to make sure that we listen. I think listening in this moment is critically important, and that we act in a way that truly reflects the lived experience of the people in our communities that are suffering. I listened to a minister's sermon recently, and we were, of course, talking about COVID-19, but he so poignantly said, we've been living with COVID-16-19 for far too long, and we've got to cure the systemic racism that leaves all of us hurt and broken and too far behind, too many communities left out of the greatness of our cities, our states, and our countries simply because of the color of their skin.
And, you know, you talk about the idea of making sure to acknowledge these are human beings. They're not, you know, we talk about hashtag advocacy all the time, right, ladies? We talk about the idea of what it means to say somebody's name, and really it needs to be a conscious reminder of all of the aspects of it and what it means to the specific and the symbolic here. I want to go, and speaking of listening, I want to go to our next question. It's from Crystal Cornelius, who's an oil and gas analyst from Houston. Mayor Bottoms, this one is for you.
On various occasions, we've had to call the police to our home to make reports of crimes against our property. Upon arrival, and on more than one occasion, the white officers have asked my husband if he is on probation or parole. While this isn't a physical assault, it is an assault on his character. What do you really think would change this type of mentality among the people who are hired to protect all, not just the people who look like them?
Mayor Bottoms, what do you say to that?
Crystal, that's a great question. And the interesting thing, I was reflecting today on an incident when my husband was detained for shoplifting. He was in a store browsing, had on a hoodie, and he was taken in the back as a suspected shoplifter. Absolutely. And this happens to black and brown men each and every day, whether it's in their own front yard or whether they are out in a retail store. And what I would say, something we've done in Atlanta, and up until Friday, I thought we were doing it right. We have implicit bias training in this city. We require people to go to the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. We have housing for our police officers in many of our communities in which they are serving in, but yet and still it's not enough. And so I don't think that we can out-train our way as a country out of where we are and how we view race and how we interact with each other. I think that while we're doing it in our police departments, there's clearly a bigger conversation that has to be had across this country, because we are not in a post-racial society and the biases are still there. And to the extent that there's any silver lining in this movement that we're seeing across the country is the fact that we are openly having this conversation, because there's so many biases that people have that they don't recognize that they have. And it's not just with our police officers, it's happening each and every day.
And you know, that's such an important thought, because it's also not just an issue of white versus black. We see the bias across the board also in terms of being a blue versus others as well. And so I'll hear more about that from you all as well. Stay with us. We'll have more questions for these mayors after a very quick break. You know, we'll ask about the protest movement that is sweeping American cities and how they've handled this extraordinary moment in history.
And if we're angry, let's not shrink from that, but let's use our anger to get results.
Looks like they picked the wrong getaway driver.
They'll be paying for this for a long time.
They will, but with accident forgiveness. Allstate won't raise your rates just because of an accident, even if it's your fault.
Cut! Sonny.
Is that good?
Line. The desert never lies.
Isn't that what I said?
No, you were talking about Allstate and insurance. Let's try again. Everybody back to one.
Accident forgiveness from Allstate. Click or call for a quote today.
We have a saying at US Foods. We help you make it. You, the independent restaurants of America. We've always got your back. But through all of this, you made it happen. You made our Friday nights. You even made us dessert. So to help you get back to full strength, we're giving away free reopening kits at our website so you can safely reopen your doors. For all you do, from all of us, let us help you make it.
At T-Mobile.
This moment right now, this is our commencement. No, we'll not get a diploma or degree of any kind, but we are entering a new chapter in our lives. Our confidence is shaken. Our hearts cracked. The kind of crack that comes from the loss of a job, from life plans falling apart. We didn't ask for it, but we are rising to meet it. And how far we've come isn't even close to how far we can go. We just have to remember how patient we were, how strong we can be, how strong you can be. And remember this, there's a crack in everything for a reason. How else can the light get in? Tomorrow starts today.
Introducing new Voltaren Arthritis Pain Gel, the first and only full prescription strength, non-steroidal, anti-inflammatory gel available over the counter. New Voltaren is powerful arthritis.
It's a second for an everyday item to become dangerous. Tide Pod's Child Guard Pack helps keep your laundry packs in a safe place and your child safer. To close, twist until it clicks. Tide Pod's Child Guard Packaging.
That message is to the American people, that Black Lives Matter, Black humanity matters, and we as a city raise that up as part of our values as a city.
Welcome back to a special CNN Town Hall event, Mayors Who Matter. Now we're talking about a unique moment in American history. There's a mass movement right now against racial injustice and police brutality. And I want to continue the conversation with the mayors who are here. Washington, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser, you know, I got to say, as you just saw, we all saw, we've all seen, the world can see now, you actually had the words Black Lives Matter painted along 16th, which is really the street leading up to the White House. Now, the next day, activists painted "Defund the Police" right next to it, and you know that that slogan has become a bit of a rallying cry for some activists. And I've got a question about that for you from Louis Kahn, who's the president of the George Washington University College Democrats.
There is an emerging debate between those calling on police departments to be reformed and activists calling on police departments to be defunded, arguing that money would be better spent investing in social services in predominantly black and brown communities. Where do you stand on this issue?
Mayor Bowser, where do you stand? Mayor Bowser, are you hearing us? Oh, well, you know what? This is an interesting topic that I know each of you will want to weigh on. I know in particular, Mayor Lightfoot, you have had significant thoughts and discussions about what it really means to defund the police, whether it's a matter of abolishing police departments or is it a matter of defunding or reallocating funding. What say you?
Well, when I hear this discussion that's really, I think, been important over the last couple weeks, a couple things are clear. Number one, the status quo has failed everyone. But what I also hear is people in my city and I think across the country really feeling like it's way past time that we invest in black and brown communities, that we invest in a system that shrinks healthcare gaps, that we invest in a system that eliminates life expectancy gaps, that we make sure that we've got good, healthy food choices, jobs that you can raise a family on, all the things that have been absent from communities because we haven't spent the time and energy and resources and focused on them. That's what I'm hearing, and I agree with that 100%. That's why from the very time that I took office, I talked about equity and inclusion, and I backed it up with key investments, making sure that we were taking the burden off of people from fines and fees in my city. We committed $750 million in infrastructure and other improvements in 10 commercial districts and black and brown neighborhoods. We've made historic investments in mental health and affordable housing and other things of that sort. We've got to do better to invest in communities, and we should not be investing here, investing there based upon race or ethnicity, as unfortunately we've done for way too long. So I agree with those who are saying much more investment has to be done in our communities.
But then again, Mayor
Laura, here in San Francisco,
go ahead.
Here in San Francisco, I just wanted to add that we took it a step further. We actually did make an announcement that we are going to reduce funding in the police department and redirect that money specifically to the African American community. And this does not necessarily mean, I know we're talking about this movement, defund the police. This does not necessarily mean we are going to completely defund the police department. It means that we need to look at ways in which we can reduce the amount of resources that we're providing to the department, redirect those funds to the African American community in San Francisco for better outcomes. And more importantly, as I've mentioned before, why are police officers responding to things that don't involve violence, that may not involve a need for an officer to respond in the first place? Looking at things that we are purchasing that we no longer need in these specific departments. So making a real reform. I think people want reform, they want changes, and I think part of those changes would also mean that there will be a reduction of what we spend on our departments in our cities.
But, you know, for example, Mayor Bottoms or Mayor Bowser as well. I know you're back on with us, Mayor Bowser. I'll turn to you on this issue.
Yes, thank you.
Is this a matter of slogan and messaging, or do you feel that it's not just that people are getting the wrong message from not having a more nuanced conversation, or is it that, look, your budget, the way you have it, you don't think you're overfunding or defunding or underfunding in any way? What's your opinion?
Well, I think, and I'm sorry that I didn't hear some of the conversation, but I know that you're talking about how we reform our departments and what types of investments we make in them. What I have said to our city council as well as residents across the district, that the budget I sent represents the amount of funding that we need for our police, but that's only one part of our public safety equation, because police alone can't make neighborhoods safe. And so I've had the privilege of being mayor the last 5 years, and what we've seen is our investments in education go up 40%. Our safety net services, in some cases, when I look at my human services budgets and homelessness budgets, go up over 70%. Health investments over 40%. In my MPD investments over that same course of time have only grown 12%. So we have to look at our everything that we're investing in and make sure that we're investing in opportunity programs like education and job training, but also intervention like our violence interrupters and mental health professionals in schools and doing all of those things. So public safety is more than policing, but policing is an important part of the equation too. As long as we're investing in good community-based policing, that we have our officers trained and equipped, that we're training them in de-escalation techniques, and that they represent our city. Attracting the best is very important to the work that we do.
So Mayor Bottoms, I mean, do you feel the same way, or do you have a different perspective?
Yeah, I think that it's very difficult for us to speak in slogans. So when you say defund the police, the solutions are so much more complicated than the slogan. I can appreciate the sentiment and where we're trying to get to, but I think you have to look at our budgets in its totality. So for example, in Atlanta, we began almost 2 years ago looking at closing our city jail because we had ended our relationship with ICE during the family separation crisis. We were no longer accepting ICE detainees. We had eliminated cash bail bonds, so if you had $200 in your pocket to pay a traffic ticket, you could pay it and go home. If you didn't, you might stay in our jail up to 6 months. We ended cash bail bonds, so it gave us an opportunity to begin to reimagine and transform our city jail and take a look at how we were even allocating our corrections budget. So while we haven't slashed our police budget because it's primarily salaries, workers' compensation, retirement, pensions, capital costs, etc., we have looked at our corrections staff and budget, and we have slashed that budget by almost 60%. So it gives us an opportunity to take some of our corrections staff and move them to our boots on the ground. They are helping us feed our seniors. They are delivering meals to our kids. They're cleaning up our neighborhoods. So we are already moving in that direction, but I think it is a great opportunity for people who are now interested in municipal budgets to really dig in deep and have some say-so, but not just get stuck on this one area of defund the police, but look at how we're spending all of our dollars.
Well, slogans, Mayor, are better than municipal budgets, I gotta tell you, in terms of the excitement factor for a lot of people about it. But you know what? If this was all you all were dealing with, it would certainly be enough. But as we know, the coronavirus pandemic is still gripping the nation, even as Americans are taking to the streets. And so the question we have is, could the protest lead to new outbreaks? I mean, we'll ask you, mayors, about your handling of the health crisis right after this break.
It's a pandemic, and people of color are getting hit harder. I am extremely concerned when we are seeing mass gatherings.
Walkthrough. And if you really like one, book a home tour on demand for free with a Redfin agent. Download the Redfin app today.
If I'm gonna be blonde, it's gotta be great.
Superior Preference Hair Color from L'Oreal. Liquid gel formula. Luminous. Fade-defying color that lasts. Preference gives you incredible dimension. Preference from L'Oreal Paris.
And I'm worth it.
Introducing new Voltaren Arthritis Pain Gel, the first and only full prescription strength non-steroidal anti-inflammatory gel available over the counter. New Voltaren is powerful arthritis pain relief in a gel. Voltaren, the joy of movement.
Could bats hold the secret to COVID-19? Meet scientists investigating these fascinating animals.
Understanding how bats coexist with diseases is critical.
Their mysteries and what they might unlock. Bats, the mystery behind COVID-19. Next.
At First Premier Bank, we invest in your success. Our customer-focused team of experienced bankers takes time to get to know you, what you do, and where you do it. We combine our financial strength with community values to provide local decision-making and a suite of powerful business solutions designed to help you grow. At First Premier, we take your business personally because we do business right here, just like you. First Premier Bank, member FDIC.
Midco Freestyle Wi-Fi opens a whole new world of possibilities, giving you the freedom to connect, to explore, and dream in every room of the house. Enjoy corner-to-corner, fast, reliable Midco Wi-Fi that you control with an app. Live it up today and be ready for tomorrow with Midco Freestyle Wi-Fi, the freedom to connect.
I'm Rosa Flores in Miami, and this is CNN.
Near future.
This is actually a live look right now at Washington, D.C., where protesters have taken over part of a major Interstate 395. People are kneeling, sitting on the ground while cars are stopped. Welcome back to our special town hall. Mayors Who Matter. The coronavirus pandemic still is killing hundreds of Americans every single day. And the disease is taking an especially heavy toll on Black communities in U.S. cities. I want to talk more about that with each of our mayors, beginning with Mayor Bowser. As you were seeing, of course, that a major thoroughfare outside of Washington, D.C. is stopped. And this is in addition to fighting coronavirus pandemic. You're looking at a gathering of people largely unmasked. What do you think about this scenario?
Well, we have had more now than 10 days of demonstrations in Washington, D.C. People are coming from around the country and all over Washington, D.C. To voice their outrage of what's happening in our country, to be heard and to demand a change. And we're used to peaceful demonstrations in our city, and certainly we're going to support these peaceful demonstrations. You're asking, are we concerned that it would have an impact on the pandemic? And obviously we're very concerned about that. We've encouraged people to wear masks, to get tested if they need to get tested in DC, or if they're traveling here to get tested at home. But I think it's important though that we not just look to protest as a reason why we might be seeing spikes across the country, because before these protests we were seeing spikes. I think at least 14 states that reopened early, or that where we saw a lot of gatherings around Memorial Day, are reporting spikes. So the reopening of America, in some cases early, has already generated increases in cases. So we can't only look to protest if we see in a couple of weeks more cases.
Well, you know, it strikes me when I'm listening to each of you mayors and I'm seeing what's happening. And we know, of course, COVID-19 affects the respiratory system. We know the impact it has on lungs. And you can't help but think about the backdrop of I can't breathe related protests. And so on the one hand, I'm sure each of you are questioning, do I want to silence people on this important issue? At what point does it take a priority for you, for example, Mayor Lightfoot, when you look at this and you see what's happening? I mean, this is really stopping the world in its tracks, but for a righteous reason. What do you think about this?
Look, all of us support the righteous civic outcry and First Amendment protests, particularly given the events of the murder of George Floyd that really sparked this movement. But we all have a responsibility as leaders in this pandemic to also exercise caution. And I am concerned about a surge and a spike based upon the number of people that have been in close proximity to each other over and over and over again, the number of people who are not wearing masks. It seems a little ironic to talk about hand hygiene in the middle of a protest, but we know that these things that we have practiced over 10 long weeks have what made sure that we have protected our cities and protected us from seeing a huge spike in deaths, a huge spike that would render our healthcare system unable to meet the challenge. So yes, as a mayor and somebody who has really spent a lot of time making sure that I understood the nuances of this public health crisis, I am concerned.
You know, it's difficult, Mayor Breed, when you think about the idea of peaceful protests and gathering and assembly, but then social distancing comes into play as well. It's difficult for people to wrap their minds around that. But I have a question for you. I want to go to Bellwood, Illinois. Amy Ralph and her brother, Reginald, recently passed away from COVID-19. Now, he was actually turned away from urgent care, and he was only 50 years old when he died. Mayor Breed, this is her question.
Decades of research show that blacks receive inferior medical care to white patients. Also, blacks are suspicious and skeptical of the medical field. Harriet Washington coined the term medical apartheid and even titled her book Medical Apartheid. What policies or programs have been implemented to build our trust and to ensure that we are not denied and shut out, but believed and heard and will ultimately receive quality health care?
Mayor Breed?
Well, first of all, I'm so happy to her to hear about her brother and the fact that he was turned away and didn't receive the health care that he deserved. Here in San Francisco, when we first issued a stay-at-home order, one of the first things we did was put together an equity team to focus on outreach in those communities that most likely were not going to get treatment, were not going to get access to testing, didn't have access to health care. And so we have a team of people under the Human Rights Commission here in San Francisco that went out every single day in various neighborhoods in the Bayview, Hunters Point, the Tenderloin, and other locations to not only provide educational information in the appropriate languages for those who may not speak or read English, but we also provided food and resources for people financially who lost their job, who may not qualify for unemployment. So the work that we did from the very beginning centered around equity and making sure that people like Reginald had access to resources. And I'm sorry that in this particular case that the system failed him. And we have to do better because unfortunately this is a real challenge all over the country. Access to health care for especially African Americans disproportionately is a problem everywhere. And that's really why when this pandemic hit, the work that we did was extraordinary. It was extraordinary because it was important to me as someone who grew up in public housing in poverty and know that when things like this occur or a situation occurs, we're the last one to get resources. We're the last one to get help and assistance. And so that was the work that we did from day one here in San Francisco, and it has had a tremendous impact on people's lives.
I mean, it's also the idea
If I can jump in.
Of course.
If I can jump in, like what happened in San Francisco, and London's been an incredible leader throughout on a number of different issues. But like what happened in San Francisco, we formed a racial equity rapid response team. And we really grounded that, again, in public health, in the science, but we also really invited community leaders to be hyper-local to reach people where they were. Look, if we're honest, one of the things that we all fought against early on was black folks feeling like they couldn't get the virus. And so we spent a lot of time doing myth busting to really reach our African American and our Latinx communities who weren't connected up with the healthcare system, needed a different approach to help educate them and give them the tools that they needed to be connected up with healthcare. And then of course made sure that we were connecting them up with testing, which was so critically important. What I've said to my team is, I don't want to build temporary scaffolding. I want to build a foundation on which we can then close these healthcare gaps, close the life expectancy gap, and do it in a way that, again, is reflecting the lived experience of people in our community, which is unique and we had to go hyper-local with trusted community partners, and we've learned a tremendous amount from that experience, which we are using every day, but going forward to build a kind of infrastructure and support system that's really going to make a difference in these communities for years to come.
You know, we're going to talk about, so go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, the interesting thing about our discussions about race and our discussions about COVID right now, what it's shown us is that in America, we've been putting Band-Aids on gaping wounds.
That's right.
And so when you peel back the layers of COVID and you look at why Black and brown communities are harder hit, it's because of the underlying health conditions. It's because we don't have access to health care. When you peel back the layers on race, it's because we are pretending as a country that we are okay and we don't have a problem with race in this country when it's very clear that we do. And so I think it's going to be interesting to look back and see how history judges us in this moment. But I can only hope that as leaders and as people across this country, that in the same way the civil rights movement was a pivotal turning point in the history of this country and how we dealt with these very prevalent issues, that we'll be able to look back and say that we made a difference in this moment in time. And just over the last 24 hours, I've heard from each of these women who we are sitting with, speaking with today. And I think people should know that there is an extraordinary network of elected leaders across this country. We may not always get it right, but we certainly are trying. I woke up to a phone call from Lori this morning talking about how we look at rural police reform in our city. I received a text from London. I received one from Muriel. And we're constantly comparing notes, whether it be from COVID or how we're dealing with the unrest in our communities right now.
And there are even others beyond you who I know are a part of that really essential network. But I want to get back just ahead, more with you, more with our mayors who matter. We're going to talk about some of that networking, some of the unique challenges that you're all facing while governing as African American women in this country. We'll be right back.
My heart has been heavy. Yes, I'm the mayor, but I'm a Black woman first.
Hey, it's me, Lily from AT&T. I'm back.
Tomorrow starting at 6.
I'm right.
Can my side be firm?
Mine's super soft. With the Sleep Number 360 Smart Bed on sale now. You can both adjust your comfort with your Sleep Number setting.
But can it help keep me asleep?
Absolutely. It intelligently senses your movements and automatically adjusts to keep you both effortlessly comfortable.
And snoring?
No problem. And done.
So you can really promise better sleep?
Not promise, prove. It's the final days to save up to $600 on select Sleep Number 360 Smart Beds, plus 0% interest for 48 months and free premium delivery when you add a base. Ends Monday.
This is CNN, the world's news network.
This is a special CNN Town Hall event, Mayors Who Matter. Welcome back. And before I lament the fact that I'm not on the text message chat with any of you, and I'm not bitter or anything. I know I'm not a mayor, but I'm just saying I would like to be a part of the chat. Let's get to some more questions instead, starting with a question for Washington, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser here. Mayor Bowser, this one comes from Zeta Andrus, who is an attorney from Lake Charles, Louisiana. Take a listen.
How do you navigate your leadership roles as mayors, along with the stereotypes that are often imposed on African American women?
Mayor Bowser?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I think all of the women here will tell you that women in leadership are questioned more frequently, more fervently, and often more wrongly than our male counterparts. But what we bring to leadership oftentimes are not just big ideas, but a pragmatism to get things done, and to really listen to our communities, use our best judgment, and move forward together without all of the bravado and ego that sometimes comes in politics. And we get it, and especially right now in Washington, D.C., where we're in the belly of the beast, where we have to fight the federal government so that we have full autonomy in our city. And I think the qualities that women leaders bring to that type of engagement oftentimes can settle down an argument, get to the meat of what our city needs, and deal with it. So what I would just say to the viewer is we just have to use all of our skills. We have to be smarter, work harder, and make sure that we're representing the views of our communities.
Bravado and ego, I can't imagine in Washington, D.C. or anywhere else. What are you guys talking about? Is this a new thing only for mayors? Let me think about that. Mayor Breed, you couldn't stop laughing. You couldn't contain it for a second when you heard that, that question. What are you thinking?
Yeah, and what I think of is, first of all, I want to step back a moment and just really appreciate the fact that I am on CNN with these extraordinary mayors from all over the country, as well as you, Laura, and the work that you are all doing to really lead and to take care of people, because that's what we are trying to do. We're trying to take care of our constituencies. This is an extraordinary time, and an extraordinary time for extraordinary leadership in the absence of federal leadership. And what's happening in this country is you are seeing mayors in particular, especially African American mayors, who are being called like never before because of what's happening around race in this country. Let me tell you, I grew up in public housing. I grew up in San Francisco in poverty, raised by my grandmother. I've had family member killed by police here in San Francisco, young people that I know, that I care about. When this happened, it brought up a lot of pain. And I think that even though we're mayors, I said I'm a mayor, but I'm a black woman first, because I have to remind people in San Francisco with a less than 6% African American population that I come from the struggle of African Americans, and that pain is rooted in who we are, and we are finally seeing something extraordinary, something different, and we want to make sure that this movement, that what we see around these protests, that it amounts to something different. And we are in a leadership position where we are doing everything we can to make change. And we are excited about this moment. We want to see results because of this. And I think that, yes, I as a black woman, it's a lot different than probably anyone else when we are questioned about certain things or treated a certain way, called certain names that maybe a man's not called or what have you. But we still roll up our sleeves and we do the work because that's what we care about. We brush it off our shoulders and we keep it moving because we got people counting on us.
You don't have the luxury to compartmentalize. I only have about 2 minutes, but I definitely want to hear from both Mayor Lightfoot and, of course, Mayor Bottoms as well. Could you? What do you think when you hear this, Mayor Bottoms in particular? When you know there's multifaceted women here, what do you think?
Well, what my mother always tells me is you only have to tell the truth once, and I just try and bring the truth of who I am to the table. And what I know is that it's all that it entails to be a black woman in America. Sometimes it means I have to work harder. Sometimes it means that even in working harder, I've got to balance that with making sure that the lunch is packed and the kids have what they need for school. All of these things I bring to the table, but what I know is that when you're leading, not to be authentic is exhausting. And people don't elect us to be something that we're not. They elect us to be who we are and all that entails. And for me, it's a black woman, and I wear that proudly, and I own it each and every day.
Mayor Lightfoot, you'll have the last word, a few seconds.
Well, look, we're all black women. And what that means is on our life journeys up to this moment and going forward, there are always going to be roadblocks. There's always going to be hurdles. We're always going to be viewed and judged in a different lens. But we are here as leaders because we know how to get things done. We do not let the critics get in our head and count. What counts is the work. What counts is the leadership, particularly in these difficult times. And I'm the most junior of the four of us, but I love these women. They have been great to me. We are sisterhood, and we will continue to move forward in our cities because our people need us to be there and be present, and we are.
Mayors, you most obviously matter. Thank you so much for joining us, each of you, tonight. I appreciate Mayor Keisha Lance Bottom, Mayor Muriel Bowser, Mayor London Breed, and Mayor Lightfoot. Thank you so much. And thanks to all of our viewers for watching. Stay with us for a CNN special report, Bats, the mystery behind COVID-19. That's next.
Let's be honest. Quitting smoking is hard. Like quitting every Monday hard.
This is why it's time that this provision in the Justice and Policing Act be passed. It's time to have a national registry that has this kind of information that could save lives and frankly also promote community trust. But this national registry would have misconduct complaints, it would have discipline termination records, it would have records of certification, it contains conditioning.
Because I asked for 2 weeks to get quarantined because of the situation.
In Maine, Mindy Bergeron Lawrence has been working at McDonald's for 17 years. She earns $12.30 an hour, which is 30 cents more than the minimum wage in Maine. Mindy rents an apartment, but because she can't afford a car, she says she walks 40 minutes to and from work each day.
I don't have a vehicle. I can't afford one. So when I'm able, when the weather is all right in the summer and whatnot, I walk or I ride my bike.
She considers herself among the lucky ones because the franchise owner provided enough protective gear early on when the CDC began issuing its guidelines. She says the owner also provided 4 hours to the paychecks of workers who have continued to work during the pandemic. But she says the fact that there is no sick pay is a major issue. When Mindy experienced symptoms of COVID-19, she says she was not able to work for a week. The Wall Street Journal obtained a memo McDonald's sent to its franchisees about reopening their dining rooms. To protect the health of its workers, McDonald's says employees should undergo wellness and temperature checks. One of the biggest concerns is how easily germs can spread near the soda fountains, which are difficult to clean. McDonald's suggests turning them off or having an employee operate them. Surfaces including counters, credit card machines, and door handles should be wiped down every 30 minutes. But are the guidelines enough for workers like Deatrice and Mindy, who worry that returning to business as usual could mean risking their health?
Joining me now, McDonald's employees Mindy Bergeron Lawrence and Deatrice Eddy, along with Massachusetts Congressman Joe Kennedy III. Thank you all for being here. And before I ask you a couple of questions, I want to let everyone know that we did reach out to the operating companies of both Deatrice and Mindy's McDonald's locations. Here are the statements that they provided. This is the Florida McDonald's locations that we have paid any employees required to self-quarantine their full wages until they're able to return to work. And from the start of this pandemic, we've reinforced our policy that no employee is required to come to work if they're not feeling well, and no hours or wages have been cut based on when an employee decides to return to work. McDonald's main operator statement said since the coronavirus pandemic began impacting the U.S., we follow the guidelines of the CDC and public health experts to continuously evolve the safety protocols in our restaurants. We're paying employees bonuses and providing employees with personal cleaning and sanitizing supplies to take home. Additionally,
administration were committed to providing paid sick leave to any employees impacted by coronavirus. So I had to read that, but I want to go to you first, Beatrice. Talk a little bit about the experience of working multiple jobs, of living with the kind of economic insecurity that you are, despite working for such a major corporation.
It's very hard. I have to maintain 3 jobs, not just 3 jobs. I have to maintain coming home to the kid. It's very hard. It's not enough money, and in all 3 jobs, I am a manager, and I'm making $8. You know, and it's hard because when you ask for time off, it's a problem. Or if you don't come to work, you're suspended for 2 weeks, or you're fired. And I think that that's very sad on us because we work generally hard. We work hard and they don't recognize our work. Even with the pandemic that's going on right now,
Yeah. Go on.
My McDonald's never shut the doors. They never closed down. My McDonald's stayed open 24 hours. Whether the pandemic was going on, whether it was supposed to be shut down or anything, it didn't get shut down. So definitely I was afraid of my life. People was walking in with no gloves. People was sitting in the lobby. They didn't care. They didn't care at all.
Yeah. And I guess the question is to both of you, but I'll ask you, Mindy, what happens if you feel sick? Do you feel pressure that if you're not feeling well, if you feel like, you know, maybe I have a temperature, maybe I have a cough, some of the things that indicate potential COVID, do you feel pressure to still go to work?
Well, I mean, they are stressing the idea that, you know, if we don't feel well, we shouldn't go to work. But, you know, when you don't get paid sick leave, that, you know, it doesn't feel like a choice. You know, if you don't go to work, you don't get paid. So there's a lot of pressure on that end to go to work sick.
Yeah. And, you know, Congressman Kennedy and your family has a direct connection to the Poor People's Campaign. So, you know, it's really great that we have you here. Of course, Robert F. Kennedy, the Attorney General at the time, was one of the people who inspired the idea of doing this. What can and should be done to change this? Because the idea that this many years later, this many decades later, we're really still having the same conversation about the working poor is dispiriting. What can be done about it?
Everything. Joy, everything needs to be done, and I'm honored, obviously, to be here with 2 workers here. And I think a critical piece to this is understanding not only that, yes, clearly McDonald's and the operators in charge of those franchises have to provide paid sick time and requisite PPE and sanitize the stores and all the rest of it. That should happen. But let's also understand, just as they articulated, when you're getting paid 30 cents over minimum wage and can't afford a roof over your head, that is a choice of our government to not raise the minimum wage. When you're talking about paid sick leave, that is a choice of our government not to require paid sick leave. When we're talking about the struggle to be able to feed a family, that is a choice of our government to allow for jobs that do not provide enough resources for a parent to raise a family. When we talk about the fact that, as you remember, there are still people that are working full-time and are qualified for food stamps. That is a choice of our government, not for welfare, but for corporate welfare to enable companies to actually pay employees so little that they have to rely on benefits in order to make ends meet. That is a choice, and we do not have to choose that.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I thank you for being here to address these issues, and especially thank you, Mindy Bergeron Lawrence, Beatrice Eddy, and of course, Congressman Joe Kennedy. Thank you all, and all the best to each of you. And coming up, a closer look at the historic collapse of the American job market.
Biden's chances to beat him.
Well, I want to go back to what you said earlier, that you need a beret to be a warlord. I have one for you.
Yeah.
I'm happy to, I'm going to just lend it to you. You got to promise to give it back.
Is it raspberry?
In person. It's not raspberry. It's green, and it's really, really sexy, and it's seen a lot of interesting things. I just want it back, but it has to be in person. Joe Biden. Guys, make no mistake. Joe Biden is not running for president.
Yeah.
That's not the guy running for president right now. I mean, everything else right now is literally theater. I mean, his whole career, he's been a construct and an empty vessel, but now there's nobody running. He's not in charge of anything. Kat said it, Joe said it, Tyra said it. Joe Biden right now is merely just riding this sort of wave of trying not to mess up. And he's not running for president. Whoever they're going to put in for the vice president slot, that's who they want to be president. And even then, all those little outside forces, they're chomping at the bit because they're going to be running the show. Because Joe Biden, God bless him, he's really not all there.
I just look at him and I go, 4 months? If he wins, 4 months.
He's done.
And he's done, and then he did his job, and then it's President Clinton. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. He's not running for president. He hasn't been running for president.
During the day, it's birds. And by being active at night, bats are not competing directly with birds. So the bats basically fulfill all the same ecological roles that birds do, only they do it at night.
Bats are unique mammals, but structurally, in some ways, they're similar to humans.
So bats have 4 limbs, 2 of them are attached to the wings.
2 of them are the wings.
Are the wings.
Yes.
Okay.
They have all the same bones that humans do. In the upper arm, the forearm, there's 2 bones, wrist bones, and then the bones that support the end of the wing are long finger and hand bones.
Bats' living and eating habits vary widely across the 1,421 species that exist. There's some that roost in trees, others under leaves, some in caves. Some bats eat insects, others fruit, or even fish and frogs.
These species, I mean, some of them are living right next to each other.
Oh, absolutely. Say 1 square mile of rainforest in, for instance, the Brazilian Amazon could have 100 species of bats.
The smallest bat in the world, it's this tiny thing in Thailand that weighs less than a penny. And the biggest bat in the world has more than a 6-foot wingspan. There's a bat that lives in the cloud forests of Ecuador that has the longest tongue of any mammal. This thing has a tongue that is 1.5 times the length of its body. So if you stick your arm straight out in front of you and imagine your tongue could touch your fingers, it's 3 times that long. And it's so that it can get into a flower to pollinate it.
Wait a minute, so relative to its body size, if I stick my arm out, if my tongue could go to the end of my arm, this bat's tongue would go 2 more arms?
That's right.
There are a number of cute bats, including one dubbed the panda bat, and another, the Kakaborasi, tube-nosed bat, discovered in 2017, which made news for its resemblance to the former hairstyle of NSYNC's Lance Bass.
There's the Honduran white bat, which looks like a cotton ball. You've got your flying foxes that look like puppies. But then you've got some really weirdly ugly bats, like wrinkle-faced bats. I like the ugly bats more than I like the cute bats.
It's a bat only a mother and Dan Riskin can love.
Blood-feeding bats, or vampire bats, do exist, but they're only about 0.2% of all bat species. They live in Central and South America and prey on the blood of birds, pigs, and cattle.
Vampire bats are super weird among bats. They sneak up on a cow, they put their face up against the cow, they've got heat sensors